Hey, we made it. Part 4 of Lecture 12. And we're looking at the heresies, those alternative art movements during the 1960s, those movements that, rebelled against the status quo as dictated by Clement Greenberg, the mainstream art criticism that produced post-painterly abstraction. Well, the real heretic was pop art. Pop art, refers to the iconography of this movement. It drew its subject matter from popular culture. And the real guru of pop art during the 1960s was this guy, Andy Warhol. And there was a famous quote by him, "Think rich, look poor." And I told my daughter that growing up, and we saved so much money from that. Yeah, and here's another famous thing by Warhol, this Camel soup can. So what is this about? First of all, it clearly spells out the subject matter of pop art. It's drawing from popular culture. And look how he presents the soup can. It's very much like a religious image. It's isolated. It's front and center. It's pushed all the way to the picture plane. Everything refers to itself. We are to focus on it, even meditate on it, just like it were a religious icon. So he presents this iconic view of a soup can. I mean, what's that about? Well, it goes back to the popular culture of the 1960s. I mean, prior to that time, America was pretty pious. We would have churches on almost every corner in our cities. But in the 60s, these began to be replaced by stores upon stores upon stores. And, the soup can becomes an emblem of our societal focus. It's, like we work all week in order to buy commodities that we consume and then discard and need to work another week to replace. So this iconic view of the soup can, really becomes, the focus of our lives. This is our veneration. We are a consumer society and we need the product. That's the focus of our life. So this iconic view of the soup can really does summarize so much of the American experience, and it resonated with the public during the 1960s. And then there's this side of American society, that fabricated fictional world of Hollywood that we're inundated with in television, magazines, the theater, and it becomes this another icon, another focus of our worship. And Warhol did 13 of these Marilyn portraits after her suicide. And look how cheaply and gaudy it's presented to us. It's like another consumer commodity to be used up, discarded, and to be replaced by another life. Warhol did a lot of images of Marilyn, and here is his Marilyn diptych. It's these two panels that are presented once again as objects of worship, of focus, and it's appropriating, it's borrowing that old diptych format where usually you find religious images in this book-like configuration, but now it's opened up and presented as another starlet, Marilyn, this superstar obsession in American society. We are looking at Marilyn in the diptych and not the Virgin Mary because American society has discarded that piety, that religious focus. Now we turn to Hollywood and not the Bible for our stories, for our edification and entertainment. Yeah, 9 Marilyns. And look what he's done here. He's presented the image of, this multi marketed, packaged commodity. She simply is a commercial product. There's like a color or flavor of Maryland for everyone. Just put it on the shelf and someone will buy it. And he presents it like a bunch of Campbell's soup cans. She, a human, a life has been reduced to just a product of consumption like a can of soup. There's a flavor for everyone. Put these products on a shelf. They're interchangeable in purpose. There's different flavors for different people, but it's all about a consumer society. This is the image of our world. It's not the image of a religious time like the Italian Renaissance. Hey, so how much is this stuff worth? In 1962, the original buyer, so there's only 13 of these portraits out there. Somebody walked in and said, I like that image. And he bought it for $312. Well, in 2007, it went to auction and it sold for almost $30 million. So not only is it a societal icon of a movie star, it is an icon of pop art, Andy Warhol. Yeah, and look at this. So the depiction of the soup can, or the Maryland, really has no gesture in it. If you look at it, the human element has been removed. It is very flat. It looks like it's all been stamped out by a machine and not a human hand. It really has been dehumanized like so much of the other art during the 1960s. And here's the point. Pop art and post-painterly abstraction, which we looked at before, have the same style. Now, iconographically, they are different. Pop art represents, imagery from the real world. But take that image away and the style is identical to the post-painterly abstraction that we've been looking at. Very clean, artificial, cold images. And that's the important point. In the 60s, we have this uniform style. Even though pop art iconographically is out of step with post-painterly abstraction, it is very much in step with the style of that decade. And so here we have both pop art and examples from post-painterly abstraction, and they share a lot in common. First of all of these images have modular units, completely interchangeable parts within the artwork itself. You could switch them around, you wouldn't notice anything. And the top three, those guys right there, also have adopted the Cubist grid. They're compositionally organized in grid-like fashion. So the modern aesthetics of modules and the Cubist grid, dominated the 1960s and also had an afterlife beyond the 60s. All right, so if we go back, and look at the public's reaction or relationship to, in this case, it's Ellsworth Kelly's hard edge painting, but let's just say to post-painterly abstraction, there's just a mental wall between the public and that art. They just didn't get it at all. You needed a PhD in art history to even begin to comprehend, the basis of its value and importance. However, when the public in the 1960s encountered pop art, there was an immediate connection with the public. They understood what it was about. They understood that this was the symbolic incarnation of our consumer values in America. But what did the American art critic think about pop art? And this is the important point. Art critics hated pop art because it dealt with images. And if we go back to the foundations of post-painterly abstraction, remember, modernist painting is headed towards non-representational art. Well, pop art violated that doctrine. So art critics rejected the value of pop art, even though the public embraced it. If we go all the way back, almost 100 years, 110 years, and look at the art establishment of Paris, there were these art movements outside of the Paris Salon and the Paris art establishment that the public related to, but the salon system and the art establishment walled that portion of art production off in order to maintain the status quo. Well, fast forward 110 years, and you have the same situation, but now with the new guard, with the new art establishment of modernism. The public reacted favorably to pop art, but all of that was walled off and condemned by art reviewers in order to maintain the status quo, the monopoly the art establishment had over, things art, cultural matters like the fine arts. So a point to remember is that there are a lot of similarities between these two art establishments. Even though the avant-garde was a rebellion against the art establishment of Paris in the second half of the 19th century, it became basically the same animal after 100 years of development when we find it in New York City. It is just as conservative, it is just as protective of its own doctrine and hostile to any dissension outside of its realm, outside of its control. Yeah, so going back to Paris, a long time ago, you had two paths open to the art student, Romanticism and academic classicism. But then, towards the end of the century, wait a second, there's got to be other ways out of this dichotomy. Yeah, and things started to appear. You could do realism, impressionism, post-impressionism, and that precipitated that rebellion against academic traditionalism. Well, now the same thing is happening right around 1970. You have the art establishment saying, look, you can do painting in post-painterly abstraction until it's perfected, and then switch over to sculpture and do primary structures. And art students, some artists, and even some art critics said, wait, that's too narrow of a definition of art production. And that resulted in a rebellion. So right around 1970, we began to see a revolt in New York City in the art world. And remember, it was minimalism that pronounced the death of painting because painting had been perfected. There you go, painting is dead. But now, right around 1970, you have voices out there in the art scene saying, no, painting isn't dead. Modernism is dead. And there's a real rejection of the principles of modernism. They said, no, we're rejecting what modernism is founded upon. Purification does not equal perfection. There's far more potential left both in painting and sculpture. So here's a timeline of events. We have modernism all the way through the 1960s, dictating what's the important art, as defined by Clement Greenberg and his followers. However, right around 1970, we have this revolt, this rejection of the principles of modernism. And you have voices saying, no, 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 modernism is dead. And from that time on, art historians mark that period as postmodernism. It's a rejection of the mainstream art criticism dominating the 1960s, modernism as defined by Greenberg, a rejection of all of that package, and now art production is going beyond those dictates. And today, quiz question, today we are still in this very long, dragged out period called postmodernism. So we're going to consider some of the main aspects of today's art following the 1970s, postmodernism, taking us up, pretty close to where we are today. All right, that's part 4 of lecture 12.